Good afternoon. My name is Deze Manon. This will be a talk held in English. And I'm so pleased to see you all today here in this room because I can introduce you to one of the intellectual powerhouses of today, I think. My name is Deze Manon. I am a journalist. I work for the Volkskrant. I have been writing about gender and gender-related violence. This year's theme of the Brainwash Festival is all about boundaries and borders. And if we talk about boundaries and borders, it becomes only logical that we talk about sexual power dynamics, the relation between women, men, and power. And more precisely, we need to talk about sexual violence and harassment. Because rape and assault is one of the biggest human rights issues worldwide. Almost 1 out of 3 women from the age of 15 has been subjected to physical or sexual violence at least once in her life. So it does have a gender component. And this figure does not even include sexual harassment. Since MeToo, consent has become a key concept in thinking about sex. Yet the headlines of the newspapers that we read remain filled with stories of the very opposite of consent. Stories of femicide, sexual violence against women mostly. Philosopher Manon Garcia, one of today's sharpest thinkers on consent, sexism, and patriarchal structures, begs the question: how can women live with men and love them more freely? Manon Garcia is a French philosopher and writer. She is specialized in feminist theory, ethics, and political philosophy. Her first book, We Are Not Born Submissive: How Patriarchy Shapes Women's Lives, this was published in 2018, won the Prix de Rencontre Philosophique de Monaco, if I say this correctly. In her widely acclaimed book, Consent, The Philosophy of Good Sex, Manon Garcia shows that consent isn't a single, neutral yes or no. It is a complex dance of desire, power, and vulnerability. Her latest work, Vivre avec les hommes, Living with Men in English, explores the high-profile case of Gisèle Pelicot. And Garcia, in her book, calls it the Mazan case, or trial, because all of the 15 men that stood on trial for rape lived in the vicinity of the French town of Mazan. In light of this deeply shocking case, in which one of the appeals took place just the other week, but also in the light of the murder of Lisa here in Amsterdam, in Duivendrecht, the outskirts of Amsterdam, this August, a case that shook the Dutch society to its core, Manon is here to discuss the dynamics of sexual violence and the interrelations of women, men, and power on the basis of ideas from all of her 3 books. Give her a warm applause. Manon Garcia.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry that I couldn't be in person in Amsterdam. Thank you, Esma, for this introduction. So today, I wanted to talk mostly about my book on consent. And it's true that especially in the context of the murder of Lisa, we decided to broaden it a little bit. And so I wanted to briefly explain to you my work. So what I've started working on was the question of women's submission, and to think about why is it that women submit to men, and what is the link exactly between femininity and submission and submissiveness. And I wanted to show, on the one hand, that there's nothing in women's nature that make women submissive or that make women love submission in a certain way, like we can hear, but also to say, but it doesn't mean that they really choose their submission, like you would choose a T-shirt over another one. That there are social structures that explain that women are made to behave in a certain way. So of course we have some freedom to not behave that way, but the path that is in front of us is a path of submissiveness. And so, because I was thinking about these issues and about how women are socialized to really put other people's desires before their own, are socialized to not even really think about their own desires because they have to be in a position of waiting to be chosen and so on and so forth, I was very curious to see how it would impact sexual relations. And it seemed to me that there was this sort of very strong tension between, on the one hand, the fact that women are constantly invited to be submissive, and on the other hand, that we tell them, look, you need to be very clear. If you don't want to have sex, you need to say no very clearly, and you need to say what you want very clearly. And so there seemed to be a very strong contradiction between what is told to victims of sexual violence, that it is one way or another their fault if they were raped because they should have said no better, they should have fought better, etc., and the way women are socialized to behave. And so that's what led to my book that has been translated in Dutch as Consent. And what I wanted to, so this book really started as an examination of what consent is and how it works, and how in this notion that looks at first sight like it's the best way to think about equal sexuality, that it's an emancipatory concept, are ingrained very many myths of the patriarchal world. And one of them being, for instance, that deep down, everyone thinks that it's only women who have to consent or not consent. And so just that, it means that we have this sort of view of sex first as being heterosexual, which is in itself a very big assumption, and that it's always men who want sex, and that women at best accept it, but don't really want it. And that sex is something that we have a very precise idea of what it is, because then we see consent as a sort of QR code or entrance ticket, like you have the consent, you're free to go. And so I was interested in deconstructing all these views about consent and showing how even consent is not the emancipatory this emancipatory solution that it looks like. But I also wanted, and I think in the context of the theme of Brainwash this year, it's interesting, I wanted to learn from the BDSM world. I think there's a lot to learn from the BDSM world about how we can set boundaries, what is consent exactly, and what the BDSM communities have done is that for them, consent is very important because it is the tool that helps them say some things are violence, but what we do is okay. And so they really give a lot of normative power, as philosophers say, to consent. But they've also been thinking about consent as a social practice. They've been thinking about what are the conditions for consent to be possible and for non-consent to be possible. How, like, what are techniques, but also what is the temporality of consent? They show very clearly that consent is an ongoing process. It's something that happens before you start doing something with one another, but also during, but also, and this we don't talk enough about, I think, after. So the practice of aftercare in BDSM is really about how do you talk after you had sex to think about what both people wanted and how it went and how to do it better next time. And so in my book, I was trying to do that. And I was also trying to say, we need to think about what good sex is. We need to, and in a way, the concept of consent so far has mostly been used to think about what kind of sex should not be permitted, what kind of sex is bad, what kind of sex is wrong. Because we've been using consent to make a distinction between sex and rape in a certain way. But I think when we do that, first of all, I don't really agree with the way we do that, because I think very often when we say at the end of the day, rape is just sex without consent. We are saying in a certain way that it is only what the victim does or doesn't do that constitutes rape. And so we are implying, and this is something I saw later on in the Pellico trial, we are implying that for the rapist, there's no fundamental distinction between raping and having sex. And I think this is something deeply problematic, obviously. And it means that in a certain way, we constantly adopt the supposed point of view of the rapist instead of adopting the point of view of the victim. But then on top of this, I think we need to think about sex in more as something more important than just something that we should decide, okay, what is forbidden, what is not forbidden. We should think about sex, including when we do not want to have sex, but as a possibility of, as a part of what the good life looks like. And in that case, maybe, and this is my claim, consent can help us define what good sex looks like. And this is my proposition in this book of Consent as Conversation. But in a way, you could say this book, Consent, is a book that is very optimistic and it's a sort of post-MeToo book of thinking, okay, we're going to be able to eroticize equality. There is a possibility of a better world with better sex. And for me personally, it was kind of shattering because then I decided to go to the Pellico trial because so I like to say I went because I was just in a bad mood about how a lot of people wrote op-eds that seemed very shallow to me and very incomplete about what was happening in that case. And so I ended up following the trial in Avignon and therefore writing a book about sexual violence. And what I found, the link between this book and between Consent and this book about living with men is partly the question of the myth that we have about sexuality, about sexual violence, and the myth that typically it's monsters who rape. The myth that a real rape is a rape that happens in a parking lot at night by someone you don't know with a big knife. Actually, what we know is that sexual violence is mostly not like this. Sexual violence is mostly committed by people that you know, and mostly by your partner. And so this is, I think that's kind of how we can make a link between the horrible murder of Lisa and the Pellico trial, is that in a certain way, what happened to Lisa is something that very rarely happens. So in the Netherlands, I read that it was the first time in 10 years that a woman under 20 years old was killed by someone she didn't know. But of course, these are the cases that really chill us to our spine, that we think, oh, it's horrible. You might be going back from a club and then you're raped and you're killed, and that's horrible. And it is obviously horrible. But this feeds into this myth that this is the most of what sexual violence is. And you have something of this sort of panic, horrible case in what happened to Gisèle Pellico, that you think, oh, it's horrible. Like, these were so many men. It was organized. She didn't know. And so there is this sort of extraordinary component that makes people pay attention. But at the same time, Gisèle Pellico was raped in her own bed, in her own bedroom, by her husband, first of all. And so in the case of Gisèle Pellico, you have the two strands, the sort of extraordinary strand that people pay attention to, and the very ordinary sexual violence that happens in the bed in which women sleep every night. And so I think it's important to remember that we have a hard time being as shocked by ordinary sexual violence as we are, I'm saying we as a society, as we are about the ordinariness of women who are raped, who are attacked, who are sometimes murdered by the men they live with. So that's kind of how I wanted to maybe show the link between this book on consent and the question of sexual violence and the question of Lisa. And so maybe just to conclude, one thing that I would like to say is that, of course, my approach is very, you could say, very cis and very straight, very heterosexual. But it's not that I think there's no sexual violence outside of heterosexual couples, or it's not that I think heterosexual couples are the norm. But what I do think is that there is a way in which heterosexuality is one of the core location of patriarchy as a social structure. And so I think it's particularly interesting to look at gender roles in the context of heterosexual relations, and to look at sexual violence in the context of heterosexual relation, to understand in a sort of way the matrix of how it works. But maybe we're going to talk a bit more about this, Esma.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. So we've been talking about Giselle Pellico, the case that you went you went to the trial. I read your book. This is an amazing book. Everybody should read it, and it's going to be translated in Dutch. You said, right? And you described in your book that you went with the idea of going for like a couple of days, and you ended up staying all the time, basically. What drew you? What kept you in that room?
So many things kept me in that room. First, there was a very broad philosophical question, which is that I realized going there that I was seeing things that was not what the journalists were seeing. So my position of someone who has been working for 10 years or even more on issues of sexual violence, of gender, and so on and so forth, meant that I was hearing things in what the men were saying, that I was seeing things in the trial that I would never find in the articles I was reading about the trial. So if I wanted to have the material, I could not count on someone else to get the material for me. But also, it was very strange for me also as a philosopher, as someone who works in a library or at my office on these issues, to see what is it to be hit by reality. And by reality also in its bodily dimension, in its, I know that rapists are normal men. I know that when you see a rapist, it's not written rapist on his forehead and so on. But the moment where for the first time you see a guy and you think, oh, he was exactly my type when I was 15, like I would have loved to date him, etc. And you don't know, and then you find out he has raped Giselle Pellico. There's a sort of feeling of vertigo, really. I had a sort of permanent vertigo of thinking, what is the real reality? Is the real reality the world I usually live in? Or is the real reality a world in which a huge part of the men that are around me at all times are rapists? Mm-hmm. And I was constantly, questioning my sense of safety, questioning the possibility, the inhabitability of the world in a certain way. Suddenly I thought, how do I raise kids in that world? Am I completely crazy to walk in the streets? Am I completely crazy to trust my husband? Because that's also the question, obviously. Am I completely crazy to think that we can live in harmony, men and women and non-binary people? Am I too optimistic in a certain way? And so I had to be there to really ask those questions.
Yeah. And we talked about the extraordinariness of this case, and also the case of Lisa, who was murdered in the Netherlands. And you say correctly that happens only once in a decade. At the same time, why is it important to include these stories, which are not everyday stories of violence, into the bigger picture?
So I think in the case of Lisa, it's just a worst nightmare, right? It looks like a bad movie. Mm-hmm. And I think about this, there is a question. So there is this historian in France right now who wrote a book about femicide, and who says we live in a culture of femicide. We live in a culture where all the movies we watch, all the books we read, it's constantly about femicides. So I was asking this to myself when, for instance, when I was pregnant and I had my very little babies. One of the things that I really liked was watching criminal shows, because one thing that is good, especially with American criminal shows, is that at the beginning of the episode, a murder or a crime happens, and at the end, the person is found. The world goes back to a state of harmony. There was something very calming for me about this. But then I started thinking, it's always women that are killed. It's always women that are raped. And so there was a sort of weird porn, like a weird eroticism of dead women that was happening, and that actually structures our society. And I think it also explains what happened to Gisèle Pelicot, is that fundamentally when these men rape Gisèle Pelicot, they are in the presence of something that looks like a dead woman, a half-dead woman that they can do things to. And this figure of the dead woman has been so eroticized that they find it very arousing.
Yeah, like the Sleeping Beauty, basically.
Yeah, that's the best version of it. But yes, and because that's something that I talk about in the book. One thing that was fascinating for me as a woman in this trial is to see how so many actors of the trial, so the judges, the lawyers, the accused, even the journalists, understood fundamentally what the men had done. And whereas for me and for a lot of women there's something deeply ununderstandable. When you watch these videos, you don't understand how these guys find it hot, for instance. You're like, this is not hot. This is horrible. This is torture. But there was a judge. So in very few cases, the men could not have an erection or could not sustain an erection. And there's a judge that systematically asked them, why didn't you have an erection? What went wrong? Why didn't you get hard, etc.? But this guy who asked it every single time that there was an erection problem never once asked, why did you have an erection? Yeah. And this is the question that I want to ask. Why do you have an erection? Especially, this guy that I found kind of sexy. He was 32 years old at the time. He had a 3-month-old baby. What do you find hot about a 65-year-old woman in a coma? Like, I want to know about this. And I think it has to do with this fantasy of the dead woman.
Yeah. How did you see in this trial concepts that you study, that you write about, like consent and submission? How did they play out in this trial?
So consent, it was very interesting because on the one hand, so legally, there was no question about consent in this case.
Yeah, because there's so much evidence, right? Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much evidence, and it's been decided by the French jurisprudence since 1857 that it is not allowed to have sex with a sleeping woman and that you can't have the consent of a sleeping person in general. Mm-hmm. And so it was very clear legally that what they had done was forbidden. And yet, one of their defenses was to say, but we had the consent of her husband. And that was...
That came up a lot, right, in this case? It came up a lot.
So on the one hand, you can think, okay, well, it was maybe the only defense line they could have, because we have the videos. Like it's very clear that they've done it and that she was asleep and that they knew. And because one thing that I feel like hasn't been discussed enough is the sound of the videos, because the videos is not just what you see, is what you hear. And one of the things you hear is you hear her snoring very regularly the whole time. So there was no way that she thought she was not asleep. So the only thing they could say is to say, well, we thought the fact that he was okay with it was enough. But this is so... It has such a place in history, this idea that the husband owns his wife and can do whatever he wants with his wife. So in France, actually, I didn't check when it was forbidden in the Netherlands, but in France, it's in the 80s that intramarital rape was forbidden. But I did an interview 2 weeks ago in Switzerland. In Switzerland, it's 2004.
Yeah.
So up until 2004, a husband had the right to rape his wife. He didn't have the right to share her with other men, but he had certainly the right to rape his wife. And so there is this sort of background of representations about what is consent, who can give consent, etc., that I found very interesting. And then on submission, it was in a way even more interesting because of this concept of chemical submission. So this is the word by which France talks about the fact of giving medication to someone to have sex with them against their will. And here it was interesting for me because there was this chemical submission. And then Dominique Félicault, when at the end of the trial, he was asked, why did you do it? Why did you do all of this? He said, I think at the end of the day, I wanted to submit an unsubmissive woman, i.e. my wife.
Because that's how he saw her, right? As an unsubmissive, strong woman.
Yeah, so he thought that she was, contrary to his mother, for instance, very free, very independent, etc. Actually, when you hear about their lives, she was still doing a lot for him and paying for him and doing a lot of things. But he had this image of her as a sort of independent saint that he worshipped. But at some point, this independent saint that he worshipped said, look, she just retired, and she said, I'm going to be spending time with the grandkids to take care of them during the school vacation. So because they had moved away from Paris, it meant she would leave him sometimes for 1 or 2 weeks. She would leave him alone. And she also said, I'm not going to do these things that you want from me sexually. These were very vanilla things. It meant anal sex, like wearing sexy lingerie. She said, it's okay if you do it with other people. I'm giving you the authorization, but I don't want to do this anymore. And the moment she refused to submit to him, the moment she resisted, it's like 3 days later, he met a nurse a male nurse that told him how to drug her. And so for me, it was very interesting because a big question about women's submissiveness is to know, why do they submit? And is it that they like it, etc.? And suddenly with Gisèle Pellicot, we saw something like, maybe women submit because they know that if they do not, they will be forced to.
Yeah.
And this is something that is very analogous to what you can see on literature about rape. When you ask women, so we know that a lot of women have sex they do not want to have. And when you ask them, like some psychologists and sociologists have done, why do you accept sex that you don't want? They say it's because I don't want to be raped. And so it's paradoxical because you think, well, you're kind of being raped if you accept sex that you don't want. But still, it's very different to have accepted something than to be forced even physically to do something. And so they accept things they don't want because they know that otherwise they might very well be physically forced and tortured into something they don't want.
And violated,
and maybe there's something like that about submission, that women accept a lot of things in a patriarchal society because they know that otherwise men will force it on them.
The consequences might be hard and difficult, yeah. You draw a comparison to the Eichmann trial in your book, the famous Nazi trial. What is that comparison?
So it's interesting because I know that a lot of people are really puzzled by it and even shocked. I live in Germany now. If you know, like the idea that you compare sexual violence to what the Nazis did, it's really horrifying. And I understand it's two very different things. But so first of all, I was a philosopher going to a trial, a woman philosopher going to a trial. So I knew that there was no way that people are not going to be asking me, what about Hannah Arendt? What do you think, etc. Then one of the things that people know about this book is this expression, the banality of evil.
Yeah.
And in French, banality of evil and banality of male are the same sound. C'est banalité du mal, banalité du mal. So a lot of journalists made the jokes, oh, these guys who were Gisèle Pellicot, they're so banal. It's the banality of evil/male. And so I wanted to take this seriously. Is it the same phenomenon? And so I had just read passages of the book. So I reread the book cover to cover when I went to the trial. And I was actually very interested in how some of her analysis worked very well for my trial. Not so much because Nazism and sexual violence have something in common, but because, first of all, she was very perplexed. What she calls the banality of evil is that she was very surprised that Eichmann had nothing to say about what he did. He couldn't, in a way, build some thought about what he did. And so historians have said that she was mistaken, that it was just a role that Eichmann was playing. But these guys in Manon, they really had nothing to say about what they did, and it's not a role they were playing. You could tell that they had been arrested 4 years prior. They really had 4 years to think about something to say about what they did.
And they came up with nothing, basically.
Yeah, especially knowing that French law is such that if at your trial you show that you've thought about the crime you committed, you're going to get less prison time. And so you're really incentivized to have something to say. And you could tell that they had nothing to say, and they still saw nothing wrong in what they had done. And so there was something going on.
What does that tell you about the culture that these men are socialized in?
Yeah, so of course, this is the question. It's a question of how men are raised, how men are taught that no matter what they do, they're not going to be held responsible. And there's also something even more profound, which is how men are not taught introspection. Mm-hmm. And introspection is not something, the ability to think critically about yourself is not something that you're born with. It's something that women have to cultivate because they know that they constantly need, so there are studies about this, but women know that because they're going to be caretakers, they have to adopt different points of views about situations to understand how different people live each situation. And that involves thinking critically about how they will be perceived and how what they do has an effect on other people, and think about the feelings of everyone. And men boys especially, are raised in this idea that other people's feelings don't matter and that they have no it's not their job to think about other people's feelings nor about their own feelings, and that they need to be tough and they need to not cry and they need to not be in pain. And the result is that even when they're found guilty of a crime, they have no tool to think about what it does to them, what it does to the victim, what it does to their families. And that I found really disheartening, because as I say in the book, it's not just that they did something horrifying to Gisèle Pelicot. It's also that they had wives, they had mothers, they had daughters. They were surrounded by women who are now in charge of visiting them in prison, having their life destroyed because their husband, father, son has raped Gisèle Pelicot. Like, in the trial, you could see that these women were here and did not matter.
Yeah.
This guy that I talked about, that I found somewhat sexy, etc. I really identified with his case because our first kids were 1 week apart and we had exactly the same age. So I really thought, I thought, oh, okay, like, he went to rape Gisèle Pelicot the day after Christmas. So, my kid was like 3.5 months old. So his kid was also 3.5 months old. I really remember very well this first Christmas with my kid. And I imagine, okay, how can you leave your newborn with your wife the day after Christmas to go rape Gisèle Pelicot?
Yeah.
What does it mean about the kind of respect you have for your wife also? Because the whole story was about how she had a big tear during the birth, and so she could not give him the sex he deserved in a certain way. And, this guy, it's very clear that he thinks he loves his wife. He says she's the most important thing that happened to his life, and so on and so forth. And you think, so when she had this enormous tear, she could barely walk, you had a 3-month-old baby, you just decided you were entitled to something that meant that you went to rape Gisèle Pelicot? Like,
You don't comprehend. It's difficult to understand. Yeah.
It's difficult to understand.
Yeah. The one thing about the trial that people keep talking about is that all these men are so different from each other. The only thing they have in common is that they are men. And that brings me to the next and maybe last question, and then we go to the audience. How do we need to talk with men and able to be safe with them? How do we live with men? A question that has been haunting you too in your book, as I read. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting because some people some people are really mad that I even asked this question.
Yeah.
And some people are really mad that I still want to live with men. And I'm like, well, even if I were to not be straight, even if I were to decide like some women do now, okay, I'm not entering relationships like sexual and love relationships with men anymore.
Yeah.
We have brothers, we have uncles, we have dads, we have sons. Like, we have to live with men in any case, even in a society. And so then the question is, how do we trust these people that we love, that they're not going to do this kind of things, that they're not even going to find this kind of things interesting or arousing? And one thing that was really disheartening for me about this trial is about how basically it interested all the women I knew, that all the women I knew felt there was something about their womanhood at stake in this trial. And the huge majority of the men I knew were like, oh, it's just a crime. Like, there are so many other crimes. Like, who cares? My dad, for instance, he told me, you're going to write about this? Who's interested in this case? And I was like, well, actually, a lot of people are interested in this case. And I want to say, if we all think that there's something about what it is to be a woman in this trial, we really need you guys to think about what is at stake in this trial about what it is to be a man.
But how do you make sure that you don't alienate men from this discussion? As I have experience talking about Lisa, for instance, a lot of men will say, well, what do I have to do with this man who murdered this woman or raped that woman? That is not me. Why are you looking at me?
Because I do think...
Which I can understand, yeah.
Yeah, I understand, of course. But it's not the same to say, you could have raped Giselle Pellico, or to say you're part of a system that made it possible to rape Giselle Pellico. Mm-hmm. And what I want men to understand is that these guys who went to rape Giselle Pellico, in a certain way, they're far in a long continuum. In a long continuum of men feeling entitled to women's services, be it the washing machine or sexual services or care, and of excusing other men for doing terrible things. So let me just give a very quick example of the trial. There's one of the accused who said the day after he raped Giselle Pellico, he talked about it with friends who were like, dude, it's intense. You raped her. It's a rape. And so when I heard that in the trial, I thought, oh, wow, finally some guys who used the right words and who identified the wrong. But then I thought, the way he told this story meant that they remained friends, and we know that the friends didn't call the police, that it didn't change anything in their friendship. Whereas if this guy had said, oh, yesterday I cut someone's arm with a seesaw, with a chainsaw, they would have been like, we called the police, this is really bad, this is a real crime.
No more barbecues, yeah.
And so this is an example of how, this is an extreme example of how men forgive each other for sexual violence.
And this is, in your view, a sense of, complicity, basically. Yeah. I want to go to the audience because we have only 5 minutes left and maybe there are some pressing questions. Are there people who want to ask a question in the front?
First of all, thank you for your very interesting talk. You talked about consent as a social practice. So how are you going to teach people, both men and women, about how to do this practice without dragging them to a BDSM dungeon?
That's a very good question. Thank you. So I think it's interesting because a lot of people want me to say it's a problem of education, which I believe deeply. But very many people think when you say it's a problem of education that it has to happen in schools. And I do think that it has to happen in schools, but I also think I don't want that it's done for older people who are more than 15, like they're screwed, they will never learn consent, there is nothing to do. So I think we need to educate about this in retirement homes, at work, in schools, in the movie theater, and I do believe that culture has a very big role to play. I think that these new TV shows that we have where we see consent, where we see new ways of having sex, like I am thinking, for instance, of Netflix Sex Education or of Normal People. I don't know if you've seen this, but there are also a lot of books. And so I think by having images of what good sex looks like, how people have good sex that is actually hot. Because a lot of people, and I was like that a long time ago, I thought, can it really be hot that someone asks you, do you want to have sex with me? Like, it sounds really terrible. But the more examples we see of eroticized consent, we can learn without having to go to a dungeon.
Great question. Next question? Anybody else? Nobody else? Yeah, okay.
Sorry, my English isn't very good, but I wonder a lot about the people. I read that Dominique asked one people, and about 3 people he asked, only one said yes. The 2 others said no, but they didn't report of any kind of manner. Do you know who those people are? Or are they in the trial also, or anything?
So at the trial, there were only two men who were there who had gone to the house, and once they had arrived, they said, "No, I can't do this. I'm leaving." But yes, we suspect that a lot of men were contacted by Pellico and said no and didn't report. The question is that it's very difficult to know exactly how many, because Dominique Pellico, when you listen to him, he says, every man I asked, they were ready to come. I only asked 50 men, only 50 men came. But we already know from the images that at least 70 men came. So he lies constantly. And but even if it had been only 70 men, the question is, it's certain, and we know from the example I used that some of these 70 men told other people. And the question that Gisèle Pellico kept asking is, why did no one call the police? Yeah. Even the guys who had already raped her, they could have gone to, I don't know, a public phone and called the police and said something wrong is going on. Why did no one protect her? And I think, I think it just didn't occur to anyone to protect her. Because I think for Gisèle Pellico, one of the biggest thing, of course, she doesn't remember the rapes, although now she's seen all the videos and the photos, etc. But she remembers having spent 10 years thinking she was dying. And, I think spending 10 years thinking that you're dying of a very mysterious disease that no one manages to find, and you're going to die, and your kids are going to be alone, and your grandkids are going to be alone, and your life is over, and no one is helping you find out why. It's horrible. She really spent 10 years focused on the fact that she was dying when it was just that she was being drugged by her husband. And the idea that no one tried to save her, I think it's unbearable.
Yeah. Maybe one last question, and unfortunately then we have to end.
You talk about all these very hard topics, but at the same time you seem so positive, and the way you talk is also funny. How can you, what is your solution to that? How do you do that?
So, first of all, I'm funny because otherwise it's really horrible. I mean, it's already horrible enough that I think we need to make jokes. Otherwise, it's just you can't get up in the morning, and it's a defense mechanism in a certain way. I was making such dark jokes when I was at the trial. Even my husband couldn't really talk with me anymore. He thought I was being too dark all the time, and but I think it's probably a question of character, and also that I feel like I have a social responsibility for imagining other options, for imagining how it can look like to educate for other options, how we can provide new scripts, how we can, I feel like we're in a world where the hatred against women is actually growing rather than shrinking. And I'm trying to, I'm not going in politics to go against fascism, but this is my doing politics in a certain way, to try to say, okay, I'm trying to have the energy to provide solutions. But don't worry, I also spend days in bed unable to do anything and deeply despaired. But I'm trying to create to not be despaired.
Yeah. My last question: your book before the book about consent was full of hope. You talked about good sex, about nice, spontaneous, wonderful sex. Where do you draw hope after this trial? What is your beam of light that you focus on? If there is some hope, because you are a hopeful person, I think.
Yeah, but there is some hope. So one thing that was really incredible for me in this trial is that the lawyers of Gisèle Pellico, I mean, no one knew I was there. I was just sitting on a bench listening to things. And during the last speech, the closing remarks of one of the two lawyers of Gisèle Pelicot, he spent almost half his speech talking about what was needed was reading the book of Manon Garcia about consent. And this was how we need to think about consent to build a new world, etc. And so it was very, of course, I was very moved as an academic. It doesn't get better than this. But also I thought, okay, I'm trying to bring tools to people so that they can build a better world. And if I provided philosophical tools to the lawyers of Gisèle Pelicot so that they could defend her the best they could, it's a source of hope.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this talk. Thank you, lovely audience.
Thank you for coming.
Manon Garcia.